Thank you very much. It's nice to be here and to see a crowd in the middle of a nice Saturday. Thank you for coming. I'm an academic. Sounds almost like I'm at an AA meeting. I'm an alcoholic. I've been an academic my whole life. I'm a physician. Spent time at the University of Arizona and the University of Virginia, where I've been for 24 years now as chairman of the radiology department. And now I mostly edit a journal for the American College of Radiology. So what am I doing writing a book like The Man Who Stalked Einstein? It's very different than anything I've written before. It goes by the rubric of creative nonfiction. Has everybody heard that term? Yes. Yeah, good. So you all know what I'm talking about. I've obviously written an enormous amount of scientific work, medical work over the years, and wrote a book called The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Sorcerer's Apprentice I wrote and published 2010 by Oxford University Press, and it's about imaging. It's trying to explain for lay people what medical imaging is all about and how it gets financed and what the political issues are and so forth. But I was on the way to writing something like Einstein for quite a while at that point. Let me tell you just a little bit about my journey to writing The Man Who Stalked Einstein. It really started about 10 years ago. We had at the University of Virginia these little enrichment programs, and one of the associate deans one day decided she would have a 2-hour session in the middle of the morning on writing creatively, either just for your own benefit or for publication. And I went to this 2-hour exercise, and at the end they gave us a sentence and said, write 2 paragraphs based on this sentence. And I did, and I turned it in, and about a week later, the associate dean calls me up and says, well, we've got a little writing critique group that's been meeting for a number of years now, and we need a man. They were 6 women, all academics, and they'd been working on each other's writing for quite a long time, and so they offered me the chance to audition. I had to write a story and submit it to them, and they took me in, and that was really the start of my creative writing career, because they turned out to be fantastic writers. And even better than writers, they were great critiquers, and they turned my rather, I would say, mediocre writing into something much, much better. I've got a ways to go yet, but at any rate, they helped me enormously. And so there came a time, I published a number of short stories in obscure literary journals, ones probably you've never even heard of. And I thought to myself, well, I should write a book. And I got invited to give some lectures in Australia. I don't know if anybody's ever gone to Australia, but it's the most expensive plane ticket you can buy from the East Coast of the United States. The way you make it cheaper is by continuing on around the world. Now, there are all kinds of rules, but if you go around the world and you stop in 3 places and you don't double back ever and you stay at least 2 days, and see what I mean? At any rate, I had an idea for a novel, a murder mystery, and there's some very long hauls on these flights. And I wrote probably 2/3 of a murder mystery going around the world in 28 days. And I still have that murder mystery on file in my computer. Haven't been able to find an agent, haven't been able to find a buyer. But I was talking, there was a man interviewing me who was one of my college classmates, and he was writing about me for the website, and he turned out to be a published author, and I said, well, how did you get published? And we talked for a while, and my murder mystery takes place outside of Tucson, Arizona, and he gave me the name of a woman who had turned him down, but he thought she lived in Arizona, maybe she'd be interested in this murder mystery. So I sent it out to her. She was very nice. She read it right away. She said, well, I like your writing, but I don't do fiction anymore. You ever get an idea for a nonfiction book, let me know. So about the same time, I know this is getting a little obtuse, but about the same time, I got invited over to lecture at Cambridge, not the one in this country, the other one, overseas. And that's a long way to travel for a single lecture. So I tacked on about 5-6 days, and I enjoy fly fishing and golf, and I headed up to Scotland. I got on a train 14 hours later. I got off in northern Scotland. And there are many famous golf courses there, but there was one right along the North Sea called Cruden Bay. And I got paired up with two Canadian brothers in their 40s, 50s, whatever it was. And their father had been attached to the atomic bomb testing. They were Canadian, but their dad had been attached to the American atomic bomb testing in New Mexico. And he'd been a very vigorous man his whole life, but at age 70, on the dot, within 1 year, he had this terrible degenerative brain disease, and he died. And they wanted to know, was that time at the test site, did that have anything to do with it? And I promised them I'd look into it. Here's where serendipity comes in. In the pile of papers that I'd cranked off, Xeroxed away at in my own little home computer, was an article that had nothing to do with any of that. It was an article from a 1946 radiology journal called the American Journal of Röntgenology. And in that journal was an article written by a man named Louis Etter. Louis Etter had been in the American military. He was a physician. He was going back to the University of Pittsburgh to learn to be a radiologist. I am a radiologist. At any rate, he got wind of this man named Philipp Lenard. Has anybody heard of Philipp Lenard? Really? This is fabulous. All right. Most people have never heard of the man. He was a Nobel Prize winner himself, 1905 Prize for Physics. But at this point in time, it was 1945. He was 85 years old. He had just been, in quotes, captured by the American forces in the tiny town of Miesenhausen, Germany. Now, he wasn't really captured. He was such a narcissist that when the American troops came and they didn't seem to be looking for him after 2 months, he turned himself in. And at any rate, Etter knew a fair amount about radiology. He had just been to Röntgen's house and laboratory and assured himself that it had survived the war. And that's where he heard about this man, Lenard. He went up, he interviewed him 2 or 3 hours worth once, came back 2 weeks later, interviewed him for a few hours again. And the man clearly was this notorious narcissist. But he made a very interesting claim. He claimed that he had invented the X-ray or discovered the X-ray, which is, you know, the rest of us out in the world always thought it was Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. Well, let me tell you what he wrote about, what he said about Röntgen. He said, Röntgen was merely the midwife who had the pleasure of announcing the birth, but who had no more to do with conceiving the child than the stork. I am the true mother of the X-ray. And so I read this article, and I phoned up this agent in Tucson who had said if I ever had an idea for a nonfiction book, I'd give her a call. And I said, I explained the idea to her about this conflict between Lenard and Röntgen. And she goes and phones some publishing friends of hers, and she gets back on the phone with me and she says, nobody's ever heard of Röntgen. Which surprised me a little because I built my whole career on Röntgen's discoveries. So I started reading a little more, and actually had read a bit more by that point in time, and it turned out that Röntgen had been merely a sidelight battle for him, that he'd really had a Jones for Einstein. All his life and in his career, he tore down Einstein and really eventually chased him out of Europe. So I pick up the phone again, I call the agent and said, anybody ever heard of Einsteins? And she flogged that around a bit, and it turned out that there was an appetite for Einstein. She got me a nice advance, and I found a couple of co-authors, Birgit Oertel-Wagner and her husband Bernd Wagner. Now Birgit, at one point I was running a very large clinical trials operation for the National Cancer Institute. And I got a little extra money to bring fellows from overseas and around the US for 3 months to study how to do clinical trials. And Birgit was my first fellow, Akron Fellow it was called. And so when I decided I'd do this, I phoned her and she said, yes, I'll help with this. They're going to translate documents because I don't speak much German. And she's also an excellent English editor, believe it or not, for a German person, just terrific, and also very good with the science. Her husband was trained as a historian, had written his thesis on Auschwitz as a corporate entity, and all together we wrote The Man Who Stalked Einstein. So we can make this interactive, by the way. If anybody has questions to this point, I'll be happy to take them now. Good. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about Lenard. He was a most unusual man. He grew up in the outer reaches of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but was ethnically German. He was an arch nationalist from childhood. His dad was a wine merchant. And the dad really wanted him to go into the wine merchant business, and he even gave it a try for a while. Hated it. He thought the only thing worthwhile in the world was science. And he had a high school teacher who really inculcated that into him. Anytime he had a little spare money, he'd go and buy a science book. He didn't think history was interesting. He didn't think language was interesting. Poetry was entirely out of sorts for him entirely. The only thing worth learning about was science. Now, let me just read you a little bit from the start of the book, about 3-4 minutes worth, and you'll get an idea for the flavor of how it starts and how we get into the story. Sieg Heil! The man's cry found an echo in 1,000 others. On the clear, cool evening of May 11, 1933, the crowd repeated the familiar Nazi greeting as ranks of university students marched past encouraging throngs of spectators into the vast expanse of Berlin's Opera Square. The students arranged themselves around an enormous blaze that the brown shirts of the Nazi SA had set and stoked into an inferno earlier in the evening. Sparks shot into the late spring night, their explosive barks all but drowning out the cheers of more than 40,000 onlookers. Young faces reflected the heat of the bonfire and their excitement at having all eyes upon them for this historic moment. At a signal, the front rows of students moved forward, stooped to gather armsfuls of books, and tossed them into the flames. They gave way to the students behind them, reciting as they did the prescribed verses each had committed to memory. Against class warfare and materialism, for the community of the people and an idealistic way of life. Against decadence and moral degeneracy, for decency and custom in family and government. The ritual was repeated until the flames had consumed 25,000 books. Among the dozens of authors whose writings had been trucked from libraries to Opera Square early in the day were socialists like Karl Marx, social activists like Helen Keller, and humanists like Ernest Hemingway. Organizers also had removed from the stacks every copy they could find of the works of a number of Jewish scientists. Their revolutionary discoveries had helped elevate German science to the apotheosis of world recognition. Under the new Nazi regime, they had fallen out of favor. As the flames snapped and flexed in the wind and the logs fueling the blaze settled into embers, a lone figure limped up several steps to a roughly constructed platform fronting the square. The chief of Nazi propaganda, Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels, surveyed his audience. His sweating, lupine face gleamed in the shifting light. When he sensed the crowd's anticipation had grown as taut as it could bear, he began to speak. So the notion is that this is really where the story almost comes to an end. It's the point at which Einstein has lost the battle, in essence, not just with Lenard, but where the Nazis have gained power and are in the position of consolidating it at this point in time. Einstein has fled to America. Yes?
Yeah, did you say earlier you had spoke to Mr. Lenard?
No, Mr. Lenard's long dead.
Yeah.
I would like to hold a seance with him.
Could you give me an idea when he passed away?
1947,
Okay.
at age 87. Yeah. This all happened quite a long time ago. And the fact is that Lenard and Einstein started off as friendly. Lenard was 17 years older than Einstein, and they took up a very nice correspondence based on early work that Einstein did and on earlier work that Lenard did. And Einstein was very complimentary of Lenard when he published his paper on the law of the photoelectric effect. Anybody heard of this law? I know we do. Now, what's special about the law for Einstein, special about the law of the photoelectric effect? Yes, sir?
It's the only thing he won a Nobel Prize for.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and the book goes into considerable detail about why that is, why it wasn't relativity, but rather this law of the photoelectric effect. So they started out very friendly because Lenard had done some preliminary investigation in this area, though he had not stumbled upon the law. And they had an exchange of letters that was rather peripatetic. In fact, at one point there were 4 years between letters. But it began in 1905, and why is that an important year for Einstein?
Theory of relativity.
It's his miraculous year. Yeah, his miraculous year, 5 extraordinary papers, including the theory of special relativity and the law of the photoelectric effect. It was a very special year for Lenard as well. Why is that? I think I've already mentioned it.
Was that the year he got the Nobel Prize?
He won the Nobel Prize that year. He won the Nobel Prize for his work with cathode ray tubes. He had invented a modification that made it much easier to study cathode rays than it had been, and he'd done some seminal work in that area. The only thing he missed, as I've already said, was he missed the X-ray. There's no question he must have seen the evidence, the effects of X-ray during his studies at that time of the cathode ray tube. But it was Röntgen who put it all together, and therein was an enormous jealousy. And that jealousy was to be made even more evident in his dealings with Einstein. So Einstein and he were getting along fine until around 1911, 1912, when Einstein took up correspondence with one of Lenard's students, a man named Jakob Johann Loeb. And Loeb initially was a huge fan, as was Einstein, of Lenard. But he soon came to find that, in fact, Lenard was really not a nice man to work for, that, in fact, he was put to tasks that he simply had no belief in, that he was a cruel taskmaster, if you will, in the sense that he would not flog people, but mentally flog them. And so soon after, Loeb, some of this was getting into the correspondence with Einstein and changing Einstein's mind. And then everything stopped. Why would everything stop in 1914? Yeah, you all have heard of it. That's good. World War I happened, and that pretty much stopped everything everywhere. But it didn't stop what was happening in relationship between Lenard and Einstein, because Lenard was an arch nationalist. And just as most of the German scientists, even the so-called good guys now, the Plancks and the Sommerfelds and so forth, they were all arch-German nationalists. They all believed the German army was filled with gentlemen who were incapable of doing any of the atrocities that they were later charged with. Einstein was exactly the opposite. He was an internationalist. In fact, he once called nationalism the measles of humanity. He was an internationalist and he was a pacifist his entire life. When it came time to discuss the dropping of an atomic bomb on Japan, he was very much against it. But at any rate, in quiet, as Einstein became better and better known, he moved from Zurich, where he originally had been studying, was unable to find a job, and so he became a patent officer. He was trying to find a job as a teacher of physics and mathematics, which was what his degree was in Zurich. And so he became a patent officer, and that was a good thing. He loved being a patent officer. And it paid about twice as much as an entry job in academics in Germany. So he really liked the job because he was starting a family with his first wife, Mileva Maric. Now, how many children did Mileva have, do you think? Two? Well, so there's Hans Albert and Edward, and there was a third, right? There was a girl child who was the first. Mileva, when she became pregnant, she also was a student in the same program as Einstein. She stopped her program in its final year. She went back to Serbia, where she was from with her parents. Nobody ever knew that she had this child until after Einstein's death and long after Maric's death. But there was a girl child. No one knows but became her, whether she lived, whether she died, whether she was adopted out, who knows. At any rate, she comes back. Things are never the same between them again. There's a degeneration in their relationship over time. And Einstein is, he's trying to just find work for his wife and what he thought was going to be his child. He had this patent office job, and it gave him a lot of time to think. And out of nowhere, in 1905, he published these 5 papers in the Annals of Physics. And it was insane. How did anybody come up with this out of whole cloth? But his reputation began to rise. And he was recruited originally to Zurich, and then to Prague, back to Zurich, and then finally to Berlin. Max Planck thought theoretical physics are here to stay. We must have this brilliant Einstein. And so he was given back his German citizenship. He had renounced it to avoid being conscripted into the army when he was much, much younger. Part of the deal was, as he became a member of the Prussian Academy, he got his German citizenship back, and he got a lot of special deals, including that he didn't have to teach much. He could study, he could write, he could travel, he could lecture. And so when the war ended in 1919, and everybody else in Germany was suffering the horrific inflation and the economic burden of a $33 billion deal on the Treaty of Versailles, Einstein had all this money socked away, and Lenard came to resent that. He had many financial reversals. He blamed the Jews, who everybody knew and still knows today control the international monetary markets. And he built this resentment very early on, became a follower of Hitler. Einstein was, of course, Germany's most famous Jew by this point in time. He had the theory of special relativity in 1905. He finished the theory of general relativity in 1915. He had begun lecturing, and he made a couple of cosmological predictions. Anybody know anything about these 3 cosmological predictions? One, he looked at the perihelion of Mercury, which means the point closest to Mercury's orbit around the sun. And Kepler, a couple hundred years earlier, but who was still in fashion with the rest of the German experimentalists, Kepler said it should always be the same place. But it wasn't. As instruments improved, it became clear that there was this so-called perihelion, that it adjusted just slightly with each pass. And Einstein predicted this out of the theory of relativity. So that was one cosmological prediction. And it's never proven, but he said, don't hold me to proof, hold me to plausibility. Is this one way that the perihelion could work? The second thing he predicted was that the gravity of the sun, or any massive astronomical body, would bend light as it passed close to this massive solar body. And in 1919, Arthur Eddington, for the British Society, placed one group of scientists on the east coast of South America and one on the west coast of Africa. And there was just a very little time to look at the solar eclipse that occurred in that year, but sure enough, when the data was in, light as it passed by the sun and was visible from its position relative to the sun during the eclipse, was in a different measured position on Earth than it normally was when the sun was not in that field. And so the crowd went wild. I mean, you have to remember there was no TV, there was no radio, there was no internet, there was no video games. People were interested in science, and the newspapers picked it up enormously. And they said, basically, Einstein has overthrown Newtonian physics. Kepler, Copernicus, all of Lenard's heroes as an arch experimentalist, and he couldn't take it. He thought that, in fact, the whole thing of relativity, in fact, of theoretical physics, was a Jewish hoax. It was never intended to be true, he wrote. It was always intended to be a hoax. Really, his problem was he didn't understand the mathematics that the theoretical physics was being expressed in. He didn't need to. Experimental physics had been entirely or nearly entirely descriptive for hundreds of years. The other thing that was unpardonable, and I'm not going to go into much detail here, was that since Christian Huygens, in I think it was the 15th or 16th century, described ether. Ether, according to Huygens, and lasting right up into that time, and very dear to Lenard, was the substance in the entire universe. It filled the entire universe and allowed for the transmission of light and X-ray and gravitational effects. Well, Einstein, in his general theory, did away for any need for an ether. He showed how the four forces were responsible for the movement of electromagnetic radiation through the universe. And so he was very upset by this. Now, before I get into how he showed his upsetness, are there any questions to this point? Okay. He organized a group called, the Working Group for the Preservation of Pure Science. Isn't that wonderful, pure science? Yeah, we know what that means now. At any rate, it was a small group of like-minded physicists and mathematicians. And he found a radical, or an extreme right-wing radical man named Paul Wayland. And Paul Wayland was working for some of the more aggressive and obnoxious groups on the right wing of Germany, and there were many, many of them at this point in time as the economy went very rapidly downhill. It was 1920, and he was hoping to remain totally anonymous, basically the puppet master behind the scenes pulling the strings. And it started out okay. The idea was there would be 20 lectures proving Einstein a fraud, 2 lectures at a time over 10 nights to be held in the very large Berlin Philharmonic Hall. The first night, 2 lecturers, Paul Wayland does the introduction. Einstein's in the audience with his stepdaughter. This is the daughter by his second wife, Elsa. Her name was Margot, and he made fun of it. He was laughing away in the seats, and people were remarking about his being there. But when he got home, I guess he didn't think it was that funny. And so he wrote a rebuttal to what he called the Working Group, Inc. In other words, some kind of incorporation intended to smear him, and it was. In that newspaper-published article, the rebuttal that he wrote, he pointed the finger at Lenard. There was no evidence of Lenard's involvement, even though in fact it was true. And this raised an enormous ruckus between the pro-Lenard experimentalists and the pro-Einstein theoreticians. And many hard feelings ensued. Einstein, Sommerfeld, the president of the German physicists at that time, tried to put together some kind of détente where Einstein would apologize and Lenard would shake hands and make up, and neither one of them was really into that very much. Lenard put the final kibosh on and said it's not going to happen. So during that period, though, as Einstein's theory of relativity became really quite controversial, they were working up to the first major German scientific meeting following the war. And it was bigger than usual because German scientists were boycotted in every other country in Europe. They couldn't attend other major meetings. And so this was where they were going to learn about new things, they were going to keep up, they were going to have a debate with each other. And in fact, on the last day was scheduled an open session to discuss the theory of general relativity, where Einstein would lead the discussion and Max Planck, highly revered Max Planck, was going to be the moderator. And it very quickly degenerated. It generated from being an open discussion to mano a mano of Philipp Lenard versus Albert Einstein. And then it degenerated further from being scientific discourse to almost, not quite, but almost name calling. I mean, nowadays it probably would have been fisticuffs. But immediately at the conclusion, Lenard was terribly insulted. He ran for the cloakroom. Einstein followed him and asked whether there was anything they could talk about and hopefully resolve things. And Lenard famously said, "It is too late." He left the cloakroom, he got on the train. That was the end of it. From that point on, he had not, from prior to that, he had not shown any anti-Semitic tendencies, though Einstein believed, well, the whole trumped up thing with the Philharmonic was probably anti-Semitic motivated. But he did begin to show his stripes at that point in time. In 1924, he wrote a piece called German Science and the Spirit of Adolf Hitler, where he lauded Hitler enormously and said that the German scientists needed to step forward and learn from Hitler and that this was the future of German science. Now, Einstein, during that time, his fame was only increasing. But starting in 1910, he received his first nomination for a Nobel Prize. And there were lots of reasons he didn't get it over the next 11 years. He had 63 nominations in all, probably a record for any of the Nobel Prizes without winning it. And there were various reasons they moved along. One was, well, relativity is unproven. Even in 1919, 1920, after the eclipse story, not enough proof, they said. So somebody said, well, why not give it for one of his other investigations? Well, no, that wouldn't do. His main thing is relativity. Wouldn't it look silly if we gave him a prize for something else? People argued it wasn't science at all, that it was epistemology, philosophy, and there was no Nobel Prize for philosophy. But what it really turned out to be was that same argument that was in Germany was all through Europe, the experimentalists versus the theoreticians. And the committee of five that selected for confirmation by the whole Nobel Assembly made a nomination for who to give the prize to each year, was dominated by a group called the Small Popes of Uppsala. Uppsala is a town just south of Stockholm on the coast of Sweden. And the five popes were all experimentalists. And they didn't believe in theoretics anymore, and Lenard was sort of stoking the fire behind one or two of them. And all of that was fine until 1921, when they just decided not to give a physics prize at all, rather than give it to Einstein. They were going to reserve the 1921 prize till they figured out somebody worth giving it to. Well, before the 1922 discussions among the committee, two of them died. And they were the two who were most aggressively against Einstein. And so a new appointee, a man named Oseen, took over, and he was a theoretician, a mathematically savvy individual who understood Einstein's work, and he cut a brilliant deal. The reserved 1921 prize would be Einstein's. The 1922 prize would be his favorite, Niels Bohr, who had made the model of the atom, and he thought this was perhaps the most elegant of all possible theories. And the third was to go to Millikan. Millikan was at Caltech and was an experimentalist whose work really further proved the accuracy of Einstein's predictions. And so everybody was satisfied, including the remaining small popes, and Einstein was given the 1921 prize. Now, I don't know about you all, the prize is worth about $1 million. And of course, all of the publicity that goes with it and the lauding. I'd have been up in Stockholm so damn fast. Yes.
1921 prize, that was a Nobel Prize?
Yes, the Nobel Prize. It had been reserved. It was awarded in 1922 for 1921 to Einstein. Einstein was angry. It had taken him 11 years, 63 nominations, and he was on a boat to Japan. He was on a boat to Japan when he got the news, and he didn't get off the boat. He said, I'm going to Japan. And on the way back, by the way, he stopped in Palestine and gave a few lectures there as well before heading back to Germany. He didn't give the Nobel lecture until a year later at the opening of a park in, I'm trying to remember where, Gothenburg, Sweden. He didn't even go back to Stockholm, where traditionally the lectures have been given. So he opened this new amusement park lecture hall in Gothenburg, Sweden, and he talked about the one thing he was told he wasn't allowed to talk about. They had given him the prize, just as we've said earlier, for the law of the photoelectric effect. And he was told, you can talk about whatever you want, but you may not talk about relativity because we're not giving you the prize for relativity. This was part of the politics. So, of course, he talked about relativity. And Lenard heard about the awarding of the prize to Einstein. He was certain that he had, the fix was in. Einstein would never win the prize when he was at the 2 years later meeting of the same one where the debate had occurred. And he went crazy. Apparently, just by all accounts, really felt totally betrayed by the Swedes, and wrote them a long letter. It was too late to do anything, of course, but he gave them what for. At any rate, he continued to hammer away at Einstein. I've got about probably 5 more minutes, and then we'll open the floor for a question. What led to Einstein leaving Europe? In what he wrote, and the speeches that were made, and the heightening atmosphere as the Nazis progressed through the 1920s, the very popular Einstein, the great wit, the great women loved him. I mean, they sought his company, and he certainly didn't turn any of them down. He was at Caltech late in 1932, doing his 3rd sabbatical there, short one, 3 months. Before leaving, he saw the tenor of what was going on in Germany. And as they left their Kaputh house, the Kaputh house was a country house, their main residence was in Berlin, he told his wife, Elsa, "Look carefully at this house, you will never see it again." And it turned out to be true. She packed 33 bags for that short trip to Caltech, just in case. And on his way back, he's in the middle of the Atlantic, and he finds, he's told that the SA, the brown shirts, have invaded his Kaputh house and also his Berlin residence. They took his sailboat as something that was being used to transmit arms to radicals, left-wing radicals. They took his violins. He was a great violinist. And they started to remove his papers. He managed to get to Margot and to Elsa's other daughter, Ilse. They got the papers, almost all his papers, out to the French embassy and managed to escape themselves safely. But what's Einstein going to do? He's out there in the middle of the Atlantic. The boat's heading for Belgium. Very fortunately, it was Belgium, all right, because he had befriended Queen Elizabeth and King Albert of Belgium. He'd had dinner with them several nights. Elizabeth was a German. She'd been born and raised in Possenhofen, a small town not far from Munich. And they took him in. They took him and Elsa in, and they gave him a place on the Belgian coast so he could think about what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. What he did almost instantly was to resign from the Prussian Academy and resign his citizenship in Germany at the same time. That one was related to the other. And so there they are. They're sitting out at the coast of Belgium, and he's getting these offers. Oxford, place in the Netherlands where he had good friends, Madrid. And while he'd been in Caltech a month or two earlier, Abraham Flexner, the man who basically saved American medical education or reversed it to where it's actually sort of semi-scientific, had been hired by Louis Bamberger, the Jewish department store magnate, to build something called the Institute for Advanced Studies. And they chose the town of Princeton, New Jersey. And Flexner convinced Einstein that this is where he should go and that he would be the second of the faculty members of the Institute for Advanced Studies. Unrelated to the university, but still a very famous place now where people go, scholars go to study for a period of time. And that's what he decided to do, but he couldn't get out right away. There wasn't a boat going back or whatever. A man named Oliver Locker Lamson, a peer of the realm of England, invited him to come over to England for a while and state the cause for European Jewry, because it was already very clear that European Jews were going to be in huge trouble. And he gave him a place on the Norfolk moors where he could spend some time. Elsa decided she'd stay up in Belgium. And he assigned, Locker Lamson assigned Einstein some bodyguards. Anybody know this story? His bodyguards, whom he referred to as his assistants, were all rather voluptuous women. And there are photos of Einstein with these gun-toting women living the high life on the Norfolk moors. When asked about whether he thought that they would provide adequate protection, he said that anybody infringing on his territory would more likely be devastated by their beauty than by their shooting skills. So Elsa was used to this, quite frankly. I mean, he'd already been through a 2-year affair with his secretary, Betty Neumann. Things only got worse. Of course, he had taken up with Elsa, who was his cousin while he was still married to Mileva, so she had some knowledge of all of this. She picked him up. They went to New York City, got dropped off into the tugboat. The tugboat brought him around to a car so that he could get quietly to Princeton, New Jersey, and that's where he spent the rest of his life. And I do want to read just one more piece, and then I'm going to answer questions. Actually, let me read something here that is apropos of the times. In his desperate ambition for power, he discovered that his speeches, confused and pervaded with hate as they were, received wild acclaim from those whose situation and orientation resembled his own. But really qualified him for leadership was his bitter hatred of everything foreign, and in particular his loathing for a defenseless minority. Does this ring any bells for the present time? Yeah, it could easily be about that. Now, what I want to read to you about, and we didn't even get to how he changed the course of history, largely by tossing out, he and Stark, his associate, tossed all the Jews out of the German universities. At 10:45 on the morning of May 16, 1933, Max Planck's driver helped the dean of German physics from the back seat of his car. Planck stepped onto the curb of Berlin's Wilhelmstrasse, running alongside the chancellery. Despite a cold, gusting wind tickling his memory of what had been a harsh winter, Planck stood motionless for a brief moment, surveying his surroundings. The chancellery was an impressive Rococo palace that had served as the seat of German government since 1875. Planck once thought it graceful symmetry, a harmonious example of Prussian architecture. That was no longer the case, not since the Weimar government had erected the crass modern south wing in 1930. It was a stain that was impossible to ignore. As president of the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, Germany's most prestigious scientific organization, Planck had sought the opportunity to speak with Adolf Hitler, the newly appointed chancellor, on the current situation and future plans of the society. He had made certain to arrive at the chancellor's offices a few minutes early, so he could settle his nerves and think about the several issues that had arisen since Hitler had taken office. Chief among his concerns was a new law that mandated the dismissal of non-Aryan civil servants. Since all faculty, the word non-Aryan was a euphemism for Jewish. Since all faculty and staff of German universities were classified as civil servants, the law threatened the continued employment of all Jewish professors. Indiscriminate enforcement of the new law would result in the dismissal of many of Germany's elite physicists, chemists, and mathematicians, and irreparably hinder the progress of German science for years to come. This would be Planck's only chance to reason with Hitler. He would need to keep his wits about him if he were to have any chance of getting through to him. As a secretary ushered him into Hitler's office, Planck considered how he might most effectively address his concerns in a way that Hitler would understand. He decided to use as an example his Jewish colleague Fritz Haber. Do you all know Fritz Haber? Yeah, he was famous for two things, really. He won a Nobel Prize for nitrogen-based fertilizer, and he also weaponized gases that were used in both the First and the Second World Wars. Fritz Haber, the Nobel laureate, had recently resigned his university position in protest of the new law. Haber was a national hero for his invention of processes for producing poisonous gases during the Great War, without which Germany would have lost from the start. Planck broached the subject delicately, but Hitler was immediately on the alert. "I have nothing against Jews as such," Hitler said, "but Jews are all communists, and it is the latter who are my enemies. It is against them that my fight is directed." "There are different types of Jews," Planck said, "both worthy and worthless ones to humanity, with old families of the highest German culture among the former." He suggested that a distinction should be made between the various sorts. "That's not right. A Jew is a Jew," Hitler objected. "All Jews stick together like burrs. When there is one Jew, all kinds of other Jews gather right away. It should have been the duty of the Jews themselves to draw a dividing line between the various types. They did not do this, and that is why I must act against all Jews." Planck said forcing worthy Jews to emigrate would be equivalent to mutilating ourselves outright, because we direly need their scientific work and their efforts would otherwise accrue primarily to the benefit of foreign countries. The Chancellor ignored the comment. After an uncomfortable minute, Hitler said, "People say I suffer occasionally from nervous disability. This is slander. I have nerves of steel," as if to prove how sturdy he was, began to bang his fist against his knee. He spoke extremely fast, beating himself into a great fury. Planck was left with no other choice than to remain silent and to take his leave. In the end, roughly 2,000 German scientists made it out, including 14 Nobel Prize winners. Many, many more died in the camps. So where did they go? Well, they went to the United States, they went to England, they went to Russia, Germany's enemies during the war. Lenard's scientific philosophy, known as Deutsche Physik, became the dominant scientific philosophy for a period of time in the 30s. Lenard himself became the personal advisor to Adolf Hitler. They threw out all the Jews, as I said. Eventually, Deutsche Physik lost its luster when it became quite clear that no science was being produced under it. And Lenard's and Stark's influence declined from that point in time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Can you talk just for a minute about the experimentalists and how they didn't feel that the theoreticians were real scientists, sort of where that came about? The theoreticians took old observations, did a whole lot of theoretical work, and then asked to have it confirmed.
That's
the other people felt you should just keep making observations.
You make observations, you pile the observations one on top of another. It's induction as opposed to deduction. And at a point where the experiments begin to jive and you can see commonalities among the results, then you have a theory.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
How long after World War II did it take, presuming that it did, for Einstein and his theories to be accepted in Germany and not be so resistant?
So that's very interesting. Once Stark and Lenard managed to chase out all of the professors, there was one left. But they thought he was a terrible stain. Anybody who was left? Heisenberg. He was a terrible stain because he parroted the ideas of Einstein and kept them alive in Germany. And so he tried to get Heisenberg chased out or perhaps even killed. And Himmler, in fact, saw that in the end they needed him. And so he survived the purge.
So was there a negative impact, this Deutsche Physik, on the German atomic bomb project?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. You weren't allowed to mention the name Einstein. You certainly weren't allowed to talk of anything that derived from his theories. And that put you in kind of a hole if you're trying to develop an atomic bomb. There's a wonderful book, if you all haven't read it, called The Catcher Was a Spy. And it tells the story of Moe Berg. Moe Berg, who was a Yankee and other team, a baseball catcher, but who, it's hard to tell exactly what he was, but was a spy in World War II. And there came a time when America was very concerned about Heisenberg and how far along he was in developing a bomb. So they said to Berg, well, you go to Zurich, where he's lecturing tonight, and if you get even a hint that they're anywhere near having a bomb, we want you to shoot him. And they went to the lecture. Berg introduced himself. They spent the evening together. He walked him home, but he didn't shoot him. Decided they just weren't close. Anyone else? Well, it's been a great pleasure, and thank you for the invitation. I hope you enjoyed it.